We want to let you know about our next institute, which is going to be on Monday, March 9th. And this is Daniel Eam is going to be here. And Daniel Eam has been a pastor in 3 different countries, has planted churches in each one of those, and has overseen churches ranging from 100 people to 50,000 people. There might be a little different dynamics between those 2 church sizes. But he has just come out recently with a book entitled You Are What You Do and 6 Other Lies About Work, Life, and Love. And so we would love to have you come out on March 9th for this. It'll be at noon, just like normal here, noon to 1:30. And you can find out more information on our website about that. So when I graduated from undergrad and had the whole world figured out, I quickly realized that some of the practical lessons in life were simply not taught. And one of the most practical lessons that I didn't know a lot about was how do we navigate the tricky waters when it comes to the transition that we've seen where we now have so many women in the ministry workforce. And I've been very blessed to have had some wonderful, gracious mentors along the way. I was just thinking through this morning the listed names, a gal named Karen Diefendorf, who really was pioneering for our movement in a lot of ways, wound up being the top-ranked female chaplain in all of the Army, and went on to do several other things. And I got to preach to her every week, and she was incredibly gracious and helpful to help me to understand it. And so when we talk about Katie's visit with us today, it's so important that we have this foundation now that has been growing. And Katie has been a pioneer of sorts as well in helping churches to understand this reality. Wherever we're at on the theological spectrum, these tools that she's going to give us today are things that are going to be very practical in order to help us to put them into place immediately into ministry, things that we can really wrestle with as our staffs and come out as healthier churches that better resemble the image of God and better uphold the image of God in each person. So we're very delighted to have Katie with us today, and she has already been teaching the ladies that were in the room. Ladies, did she do a great job this morning? All right, they kicked me out, so I couldn't be here for it. But we are grateful to have her to come. Let's give a big Institute welcome to Kadi Cole.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate being here. Thanks for the introduction. It is really an honor to be here, especially, sorry, do you want me to change? Okay. Especially to be able to talk to church leaders. And so before I really jump into the content, I do just want to pause for a minute and say thank you for what you do currently in local church ministry, what you're training and learning how to do with your ministry calling and really your career. I was in the 2nd grade, 8 years old, when my mom and my sister and I, our 3-person family, walked into a church for the very first time. And we were in a state where we didn't have really anything to offer at church, although my mom was a really great pianist, so they did enjoy that. But from definitely a spiritual standpoint, and definitely for me as a little girl, nothing really to offer. But in the midst of that local church of just 150 people, we had amazing leaders and pastors and disciple makers just wrap their arms around us and welcome us, help us find our leggings with the Lord, help us create a real healthy family, even though there were just 3 of us. It's where I got multiple surrogate dads and grandpas and people who affirmed things in me and spoke life over me and helped me know that God had a really big plan for my life. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew that He was a good and loving God and that I mattered in the world. And so when you show up at your church on the weekend or at your small group or your student ministry night or whatever it is that God has called you to do in this season, I just want to thank you for that job and for showing up so faithfully to do it, because there are little 8-year-old girls out there all over, and little boys and broken moms and, unhappy dads, and we're all over. And what you do really matters. It's changed the whole trajectory of my family tree. It is changed the dynamics of what I'm able to do now as a wife and a mom. It just really matters and has eternal significance. So thank you for that. And it's really an honor to come and talk to you in general about leadership, but particularly about this subject. But I just want you to know it comes from a heart of real gratitude and honor for who you are and what you're doing in the kingdom, because it really matters. A couple years ago, I started working in church leadership environments. I'm from the Northwest. I went to college in Seattle where I became a nurse. I thought I would be a medical missionary, because coming out of that little 150-person church, I thought that's like what godly people did, is become missionaries, which is true, but they do other things too. Anyway, I became a nurse, was going to go on the mission field. I ended up in South Florida because I was paying back a scholarship from college, and ended up serving in local church ministry. And it was such an eye-opener for me, particularly in the big city of West Palm Beach, because in the little town of Missoula, Montana, our Christmas Eve service was really an open mic night talent show. So there was one teenager who ran the sound. Anyone who wanted to sing, anyone who wanted to do a drama, poetic reading. I played my recorder several years in a row. Got to do it. And so that experience of church, where I loved it, I loved the people. It was kind of old family night. Never a place you would want to invite your unsaved friend ever. That's the worst thing you could do for their spiritual growth. Then I showed up in Florida in sort of the mid-90s when the seeker movement had taken off, and I walked into this church and there was like a stage, a drama, back when dramas were cool. There was music that was good, guitars, things like that. The preaching actually mattered. It wasn't the same story I'd been hearing, since the second grade my whole life. All of that, and my eyes just got opened to what it's like when you actually unleash the power of giftedness of your church family into a community that needs to hear about the Lord, that God actually anoints that to happen. And they were a church that looked at me and said, you have gifts, and we think you're in Florida on purpose, and so we want to use that. So my nursing career went from nursing to working at a Christian university, so I'm very excited to be here today. Eventually grew to become Dean of Student Development, and then that church had grown dramatically, and they recruited me to come on staff. And so I spent 16 years working with the senior and executive team, eventually became the first female executive director. I ran all the multi-sites because I had launched all the campuses. So that church that was a couple thousand when I showed up and couldn't believe what this was. When I left staff 3.5 years ago, we had 9 campuses, 23,000 people, and we had started a school of leadership and a college on site, all these sorts of things. And so that ride was really an amazing experience as a believer. It was an amazing experience as a leader, as someone learning ministry. And then I started working with churches, and I would be in networking groups like this and conferences talking about multi-site strategies and leadership development and all those things I love to work on and talk about. And a couple years ago, maybe about 18 months ago now, I was in a room almost like this size, and at lunchtime, there was an executive pastor and his senior pastor, and they wanted to sit with me at lunch and ask me a few questions. And I figured they're going to talk to me about their campus and pull up their heat mat and do all those things. And instead, they said, we have these couple of young female leaders on our staff, and we really want to develop their gifts and really help them learn how to be everything God has called them to be. And we think we're doing right, but we wanted to get your opinion on what we were doing. And so first of all, I'd been in ministry over 2 decades, and I had never, ever had a guy ask me that question before. So right off the bat, I think they're awesome. I'm like, what a great question. Thank you for even wondering about it, thinking about it, asking for help with it. So we sat and talked through some stuff, and everything they were doing was really great. There were a couple things that we had to tweak a little bit because they just weren't quite sure of how that was probably going to get interpreted, but it was a great conversation. Over the course of the next couple months, I had that same interaction happen 2 more times. And when God does something weird 3 times in a row, it kind of gets your attention. And so I started realizing, man, this is a conversation that people are starting to really take note of and figuring out how to do. And so because I'm kind of an HR research nerd, I decided to research that gap between what these guy leaders, pastors, godly men were doing to help women and these women who were kind of coming up in leadership. There was this space in between what they were trying to do for these women and what these women were experiencing or hearing from them. And so that gap right there, I spent several months doing research in all sorts of domains, academic, marketplace, and ministry research. I interviewed 30 female leaders in church leadership who had sort of broken through what we call the stained glass ceiling in church. So they were leading at the executive level over their big churches. And then I sent out a survey and got results back from 1,200 women who were working and serving in church leadership and put all of that together. And out of that sort of bubbled up these 8 best practices of what leaders and churches can do to do a better job developing the female leadership in their church. What was so interesting about the research, and particularly about these 3 churches that kind of got me started in it, is that they were from very different theological perspectives. One was very conservative, one was very progressive, and one was kind of like in the middle, not really sure, but this is kind of what we're doing. They were from different parts of the country, so the cultural context in which they found them in, some very liberal, big city environment, some very country, some kind of in the middle. And then they were also different sizes. And so part of that, and part of what we found in the research, is that the theological issue, which is a very important issue, by the way, but is actually a secondary issue to what we found made churches do a great job really stewarding and developing the leadership talent of both their men and their women. So what I want to talk to you today about is kind of 3 keys. So the book has a lot of content, a lot of research. It has 8 big practices that you can really look at as your own leader. So if you lead something by yourself, it's practical things you can do in your own leadership and with your own team. But it also has bigger organizational implications that if you as a senior leader, as an elder, or as someone who has a voice or wants to bring this perspective to your church, there's organizational shifts that can be made also. So I will suggest to you, if you've got questions as I go, I'm going to walk through these 3 keys. Please write down your questions because I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end. And I just want to assure you that this is a safe place to ask a potentially uncomfortable or dumb question. I can handle it. You're not going to offend me. I'm sure we're all up for the gracious conversation. So please write those down, and we'll do that at the end. So the first key. Oops, here we go. So this is the book if you're interested, and we're going to be talking about maximizing female leadership in your church. So the first key is to clearly define your theology. Clearly define your theology. I mentioned that the churches I interviewed and did research on had very different theologies, and that really wasn't a big indicator. Now, obviously, if you're in a very conservative theology where women have certain roles that they can and cannot play, that does make an impact. But the way that we develop women and the way we empower them to fulfill any of the roles we actually know they're called to fill changes dramatically if we can clearly define our theology. Now, here's why. Most people are confused by this topic. And in fact, most of the women that you want serving as leaders in your churches have been around church for a long time. They're probably not a brand new Christian. They probably have been walking with the Lord. They've been in your church or perhaps multiple churches. In fact, most people who lead church now, at least half their congregation came from other places, other churches. So they bring those perspectives, those theologies, that baggage, all of those things into your congregation. And every godly woman who's been in a church knows that this topic matters. And they know that there is a line somewhere. And when you really love the Lord and you really respect your leaders, godly leaders don't want to mess up. We don't want to sin. We certainly don't want to undo what it is we've been given. We don't want to step over the line and go outside the boundaries that you or God has given us. And so godly women tend to hold back if they don't know where the line exactly is. Here's sort of the picture I have for it. You have a theological line, but if women are unclear, they'll kind of make a guess of it, of where it's at in the middle, and then lead below that so that they don't come anywhere near stepping over the line. Can you see the challenge with that? There's this big gap between what you actually would welcome a leader to do, what you want the women in your church to be stepping up and doing, and what they feel they're allowed to do. So I see this in all sorts of ways. I talk about a couple stories in the book and things that I even experience on a weekly basis as I talk with women and leadership teams, is that this plays out in very surprising ways, and many times leaders are really unaware of it. So I remember talking with a woman who led the greeter team at her church, and her biggest question about theology is that she was unsure if she was allowed to pray out loud in her greeter team meeting if there were guys on the team. So for a long time in her church, the women were greeters, the ushers were men, and they had sort of been raising up women leaders. And so can you believe it? A guy became a greeter, and it totally threw her off. This is a woman who'd been serving in leadership for over 20 years. She had been doing this job for a number of years, had full confidence in it, but a guy shows up. Now, this guy was new. He had just gone through the new member class. He accepted the Lord. He found this place to serve. He didn't know that only greeters are girls. He thought he'd be a great greeter. So he showed up, and it totally throws her off. And she's like, I wonder, maybe he should close in prayer. This is the thought she's having in her mind. Now, I've worked with enough pastors to know that if you had the choice of who's going to pray out loud in front of a big volunteer team, the woman who's been with you for 20 years, who knows her Bible and you trust and fully, or the brand new believer who's probably even never prayed out loud, you would want her to say the prayer, right? Instead, she hands it over to the guy, right? Bad for both of them. A big piece of it is because she wasn't quite sure. She knew there was a line about what women could do. Now, what's really interesting is that most men don't realize that when you grow up in environments that teach you about submitting to men, that which there's a theological case to be made on all along the spectrum. So I'm not taking a theological view, but when you grow up in a culture, even if it's not what your church believes, but I grew up in it, and the focus of my leadership has been to make sure I don't overstep the men around me. Even very conservative environments, they're really teaching about the headship of the senior pastor and the headship of the husband and dad. But for women, when that's most of what we hear growing up, it's easy for women to assume that means submission to all men in every context. They don't know enough about the content, and they haven't been taught enough about the specifics of what their theologies really are to know that there's a difference. That as a strong, mature believer, you have a spiritual authority over every unbeliever. That's something she should be walking in. Now, when it comes to certain roles and responsibilities and certain theologies, there are limitations in some places. But when it comes to believers, we have the authority of Christ that doesn't change. Most women are not taught that. They're over-taught submission, under-taught their authority. And so these are the people leading in your ministry that seem confident, that seem to have it together, that seem like they don't have anything going on, and they're wondering what they are allowed to do or not to do. So it's very critical to clearly define your theology. Now, I'm not saying that you should, next week, open up a 6-week sermon series on the theology of women and what you're going to do and not allow to have happen. It's not the way you create great change around this topic. But I would say if this is an area that is a little unclear in your ranks, first of all, if you're the senior or executive leader, chances are it's clearer for you than it is for everybody else. I am amazed at how many senior pastors I talk to who are like, everybody knows what I think on this subject. And you go down one layer and no one knows what he thinks on this subject. So the clarity that you might have as a top-level leader is probably not making its way all the way down. If you have really strong theological statements in your membership class, on your website, that does help. But if you don't, which most churches keep those things a little off the front burner, so chances are there's more confusion than you think. And part of the reason, like I said, is women come in with these sort of approaches or conditionings or things they've learned or assumptions they're making, but so do all the guys coming into your church. And so that head usher has a theology that he's operating off of with the head greeter, and they're butting heads on things because they aren't sure what you believe. So taking the time, and in the book there's a lot of really practical steps about how to engage this conversation and move it through in a way that doesn't undo your culture or create division in your church. The goal is to actually get your arms around your whole church and make sure everyone's marching off the same game plan, beating to the same drummer. I do have a couple resources if you're interested. On my website, under the resources page, I have a theological cheat sheet. Part of the challenge, this is a little confusing for people too, is because we've tended to talk about this topic in very binary terms. I'm either complementarian or I'm egalitarian, and you're either one or the other, and you must decide right now, and then we're going to debate you on it. That is not actually how it ends up playing out, especially in frontline church ministry, where most of your women are serving. So on there, I have a cheat sheet that actually talks about what I think is a better way to describe this, which is more of a spectrum, where you have some that are very oriented, very conservative, more on the complementarian, strong complementarian, all the way over to strong egalitarian, and many places in between. And I would even say the less connected to a denomination a church is, the more unclear this probably is, because there isn't a higher body sort of dictating some of these theological truths. So take the time to look at that. If you're looking for a great exercise to do with your team, download the cheat sheet. Have everybody download it, and then draw 3 circles. One is, what do you think our church's belief is this? What do you think your belief is on it? And what do you think most people experience? What's our church's belief? What's your personal belief? And what is our church body mostly experiencing in the culture? The more those 3 things are lined up, the stronger and healthier your culture is for women. The more disconnected your team is on those 3 things, the more confusion and the more sideways leadership energy you're wasting for women and men, with being uncertain about what they can and cannot do and how they should and should not be interacting with each other. So that's the first thing, is to clearly define your theology. Clearly define your theology. Key number 2 is to reach beyond the sticky floor. Reach beyond the sticky floor. I mentioned the glass ceiling, or the stained glass ceiling as we call it in church. Those are the invisible barriers, organizational structures, kind of usually they're sort of inherited practices that we may not even be aware of, that sort of limit women's ability to grow up into higher levels of leadership position. Women know that it's there because they keep bumping their head against it, and that gets painful after a while. So there it is, the glass ceiling. But more important than just the glass ceiling, although that is very important to take a look at, is what we call the sticky floor. That's on the other side of the spectrum, and it's what actually keeps women's feet stuck to the floor and prevents them from rising in leadership. So the sticky floor are really those internal dialogues and conversations that women have with themselves about themselves. Negative thinking, feeling like they don't belong, figuring there's someone better at this job than they are, wondering why they would ever be asked or be given this opportunity, questioning their gifts, questioning if they really have a right to lead, questioning if God has really called them, questioning if they're good at anything at all. It's amazing, and I think most men are surprised to learn all the negative thinking and frameworks that women have in their mind, particularly when it comes to leadership, and especially when it comes to spiritual leadership and formal roles in the church. It's so fascinating to me because women make up 61% of the average congregation, but less than 10% of formal leadership roles. Think about that. Over 60% of the congregation, less than 10% of formal leadership roles. Now, there are some high-level leadership roles, but formal leadership roles is like Bible study teacher, director of first impressions, the membership class coordinator, like formal leadership roles. And many men look at that and go, I guess women just don't want to lead. But what I think we're missing is not only the glass ceiling, but also this idea of the sticky floor. One of the interesting research pieces that I talk about in the book that describes the sticky floor perfectly is that men and women tend to look at leadership opportunities totally differently. So when a guy looks at a job description, whether it's for his career or it's a volunteer role in the church, or you want him to be an elder or come on staff or whatever it happens to be, when they look at it and read what's required of the job, if they feel confident of 60% of what's on the job description, they'll apply for the job. They figure they'll probably get it. If they don't know what they're doing, they'll call their dad, or they'll Google it, or they'll fake it till they make it, but they are going to crush this job. That's the average guy's perspective on a new leadership opportunity. When a woman looks at a role description or a leadership job opportunity, she measures herself very differently. When she looks at the job description, she has to feel 100% confident about every single thing on the job description, or she won't even apply. Think about that. She won't even apply. Now, in most of our leadership environments, when we are wondering, gosh, who are the leaders that God has brought to our congregation, we're looking for the people who are applying for opportunities, right? We're looking for the person that's like, put me in, coach. Hey, I've got this thing. What do you have anything that you can use me for? They're people who are forward. They're people who are offering themselves. They're people who are going for the job. That's how you know to take them seriously, is they keep applying for jobs. Eventually, they come on staff. That's like what it does. But when you have a woman, no matter how qualified, no matter how experienced, no matter how many degrees, look at an opportunity that you're advertising, she goes, I've never done that job before. I'm not going to be good at it. I don't think that's who I want. Well, I always ask women, I'm like, well, how many of us have actually applied for a new job or a promotion and we knew what we were doing on the first day, right? Not at all, because it's a new job. It's something new we've never done before. So women oftentimes, because of the sticky floor, take themselves out of the running. So part of what we can do as church leaders is to actually reach beyond the sticky floor, to realize that women are putting this kind of perfectionistic tendencies on themselves, that they have a hard time seeing what their giftedness really is. Most of them have not had their spiritual gift or their leadership capacity affirmed in very many ways, particularly inside the church. And so you have a real opportunity to notice gifting, to affirm calling, to recruit them into opportunities that this woman has probably never received this kind of individualized feedback on her potential before. You have the opportunity to recruit her to the job. And it's very simple. It just takes a little extra awareness and a little extra effort to be able to say, hey, let me talk to you about this first impressions coordinator role that we have. Now, you've been running the greeters for 10 years. You also took over the usher team, and you initiated the parking lot ministry. By the way, these are the 3 teams on the First Impressions team. So I know you think you're underqualified, but you've actually been doing this job before. See this part about leading a team meeting? I went to your team huddle. You do an amazing job. I know you thought you were filling in, but you were actually doing a great job. You already are leading people. You already are discipling people. You're doing all the things. You have to help her connect the dots, because the sticky floor is keeping the dots from being connected. And I think sometimes it throws a guy off when they see a very talented, high-capacity female leader who keeps turning down opportunities. Because guys hardly ever turn down opportunities, but women do it all the time. And I will admit that they usually play, the kid card or the overwhelmed card or the da-da-da card. I'm just encouraging you to have a real leadership conversation. You can't make her take a job, but you can affirm her giftings and plant seeds in her mind that might not be fruitful for this role, but will definitely be sprouting seedlings for the next one. So take the time to reach beyond the sticky floor. One other way that we can really overcome the sticky floor is to give candid feedback to the women on our teams. And I think for those of us in ministry, this isn't just like staff women. These are all the women who are serving, particularly in leadership roles in our church. Most women, when they get feedback after doing anything in a leadership realm, get very vague feedback. Good job, girl. That was awesome. Great to see you up there. I love having women on the stage. Good job on announcements. You look so cute. We hate that one, by the way. But they get very vague feedback. When male leaders, when guys get up and give announcements for the first time, or give their first devotional and student ministries, or lead their first team meeting on the mission trip, they get a lot of really constructive feedback from their leaders. Dude, that was awesome, but when you open in prayer, it should be less than 7 minutes long. Like, they tell them exactly what they can do to improve. Hey, great job announcements. The next time you do it, I want to see you do da-da-da-da-da. Remember to connect it to vision. Remember that we don't need everything in the program. Like, let me tell you, and the key phrase being, hey, the next time you do it, work on these. What women usually get is a critique from other women that make them feel like they should never try this again. So if you are in a leadership role, particularly with authority, which chances are that means you're a guy, taking the time to give some great constructive feedback. What went great? What should be improved for next time? And what did you see in her that you had never seen before? What did you discover about her potential? We can't affirm our own gifts. God demands that our community of leaders affirm our giftedness. So if you're waiting for women to know these things about themselves, it will never happen. You're the one who gets to unlock their potential by noticing, by talking about it, by affirming, and by giving a next step. Another way that we can reach beyond the sticky floor is to watch how we introduce women. So the research would tell us that in all contexts, not just church, even in the marketplace, that most men are introduced when they're about to get up and speak, or a new promotion, or meet in front of a client. They're introduced by their accomplishments. They have these degrees, they've done this number of sales, they lead a church that's this big. These are the things they've accomplished. These are the things that give them expertise and authority and why you should listen to them. Most women, when they are introduced based on their relationships. This is Katie. She's married to Matt. She's got a 16-year-old son. They've been married for 22 years. She's the daughter of so-and-so. Her best friend is the pastor's wife of da-da-da. Like, it's all based on relationships, which means that when a woman takes on a leadership responsibility, her first job is to help them know that she's a leader, that she's capable, and that she's been given the authority to do what's been asked of her. Guys walk in, and from the moment they're introduced, they have the authority and the respect and the ability to prove themselves. Does that make sense? So as you're positioning women for leadership, no matter how small the role, challenge yourself. And I would say, even as a woman, this was one of the pieces I had to work on, because I would naturally do a resume introduction for the guys on my team and do a relational introduction for the women. So challenge ourselves. How are we introducing women? Are we actually giving them leadership lane? Are we talking about the most important things that encourages and gives her the ability to deliver on what we've asked her to do? The next thing about Sticky Floor is what I call sponsorship. So there's 3 ways that we develop women organizationally, develop any leader. One is through mentorship, which is a relationship around skill, and a more interpersonal connection. Coaching, which has to do with really moving people up and challenging them with accountability. We tend to do mentorship and coaching pretty well in leadership circles. Women oftentimes don't have great female coaches, so that's one of the investments you can make for the women on your team if you don't have high-level female leaders, is coaching female coaches. But the third part is this idea of sponsorship. So in mentorship, people talk with each other. In coaching, I give you goals, but in sponsorship, I talk about you. I actually am doing actions not in connection with you that help you in your leadership. So that means that if you want to help women rise up in leadership, get to know the women on your team. Get to know the female leaders in your church. And when you're in a meeting talking about the new initiative, think of the women you know and sponsor them. Put their name in the hat. Advocate for why they would be great on that team. When you know you're going to launch a campus or start a new ministry, think about the staff women that you have on your team. Who's got a calling in this area? Who's got a passion for this? Who has experience before that they've never known? One of the most important questions you can ask is, tell me about your leadership and what it's like to be a female leader here. Tell me about your leadership experience, and then tell me what it's like to be a female leader here. You get to understand the real story of the women in your church. And you get to understand what limitations they're running into that you're in charge of stewarding. I have a senior pastor friend who took that challenge and asked this young mom who he was just always really impressed with when he talked to her. She was a stay-at-home mom. She had like 3 little kids, but she was always just a little bit put together. She would ask really interesting questions as he shook hands as she left all the time. And so when I was talking about this idea about asking women, what is it like to be a female leader here? Tell me about your leadership experience. What's it like to be a leader here? He decided she was going to be the one because he just felt like she was a little bit well-read and kind of knew had read some of the books that he had read. So it intrigued him. So he caught her in the lobby one day and said, hey, tell me a little bit about your leadership experience. Well, she had a seminary degree. She had been a foreign missionary and started multiple churches. And then she'd gotten married, and now she had kids. And he had no idea she had any of this experience. He even says, I thought she was just a stay-at-home mom that was like really great at organizing the 2-year-old classroom. And I just saw great leadership in her. I had no idea the wealth of knowledge and experience she had. I think she also spoke 2 other languages. So within a couple months, she's leading all their mission outreach programs and partnering with global mission organizations across the world because he took the time to kind of look past the assumption and just ask the question. Now, it could have been that she dropped out of high school and had kids, at 17. But in this particular case, that wasn't it at all. And he could leverage that leadership in a new way. And she got to realize that her ministry calling doesn't pause or stall because she had kids. She does it as a volunteer 5 to 6 hours a week. She could easily be doing that as a 2-year-old classroom leader, but she's in a place that's such a sweet spot because he took the time to overlook the sticky floor. So tell me about your leadership experience and what's it like to be a female leader here. All right, key number 3, what I call always take 2. Always take 2. So the Billy Graham rule has been a really wonderful gift, in my opinion, to leadership circles and our churches in terms of protecting our purity, protecting the integrity of our churches, making sure that we have safe experiences for women and men and kids in everything that we're doing in ministry. Because at the end of the day, those are the right and wrong morality issues that really matter. And one move in the wrong direction on that takes an entire ministry down. So I'm not at all interested in throwing all of those things out the window. However, I do think that the Billy Graham rule, which was incredibly effective in 1948, is having some challenges in 2020. The last 2 churches that I've consulted through a moral failure with one of their pastoral staff never rode in a car together, never met for dinner in person, never snuck off and met in a hotel or traveled together. It was all done through fake email accounts and text messages to one another. So my issue is that I think the Billy Graham rule hasn't stretched far enough to navigate our current culture and the digital age. So just a little history on the Billy Graham rule, which I find really fascinating, is that in the mid to late 40s, Billy Graham and his team were doing evangelism meetings all over. There were actually a lot of evangelists happening. He wasn't the only show in town. And so these other evangelists were showing up and having affairs with women and taking money from churches and lying about their attendance. And these evangelism tours were getting so much attention that media was starting to follow them because there'd be tent revival meetings for days on end in huge cities like LA and Chicago. So they started traveling around, and the news media is going to the events. And they're watching this evangelist say that 1,000 people came and there was only 200 people there. I mean, I'm all for pastoral math, but that is like too extreme right there. So they start exposing them in the papers. They go out to dinner and they see some guy with a woman kissing in the back corner of a restaurant. Like, they're exposing these things. So Billy Graham and his team get together and are like, this is not healthy, not good. It's tarnishing the name of Christ. It's killing the momentum that we're seeing of what God is doing in this. What can we do to create boundaries so that if the media ever sees us, there's not a question about what we're doing? They don't even have room to assume something negative or snap our picture and take it out of context. We've got such protection that we aren't going to get lumped in with these other guys who are really immoral and taking advantage of churches and people. And so they decided on 4 basic things. They called it the Modesto Manifesto because they happened to be in Modesto, California when it happened. So it had to do with we will never take money from a church or do a love offering because we don't want to emotionally manipulate people with spiritual truth and then have them give us a lot of money. So they always did their fundraising ahead of time before they ever went to a meeting, so they were never tempted to ask for a donation on site. I think that's fascinating. Secondly, that they would always support local churches because many of these evangelists were coming in and advertising like crazy and having these big tent revivals and then asking everyone to give all their tithes and offerings and all their volunteer hours now to the evangelistic movement instead of the local church. So Billy Graham said, we're not going to do that. We're going to only go in and support local churches and then hand people off to local churches. Again, a great thing. Number 3, we will always be more than accurate on our numbers so that no one can actually accuse us of inflating numbers or pretending like God is doing something more than he is. We only want to celebrate actually what God is doing. I actually think all 3 of those would be great for most ministry leaders to embrace. As well as the 4th one, which is that we want to make sure, because we're away from our wives for a long time, and this was a totally different time, like there weren't even telephones in your room in a hotel. Like they had to go to the office to call their wives. They were gone for weeks at a time. We will never drive in a car or meet for dinner any longer with a woman because it could be someone could take a picture and use it and assume that something else was happening, which I think is really interesting that up until that point they actually did do that because these were leaders of churches and leaders of denominations and people with money and influence. And so those were the 4 things that they agreed to. We, of course, when we talk about the Billy Graham rule, only talk about the one of men and women being alone together. Now, I love this rule. I've grown up in ministry with windows and offices and riding always in cars where I felt very safe. I've never had anything inappropriate happen to me with a pastor or someone in spiritual or employment authority over me. I've had plenty of awkward moments, but nothing that would qualify for really inappropriate. And I am incredibly grateful. I am incredibly grateful. I can't imagine, after graduating, moving and volunteering in my church at 21 or 22 years old and having a pastor make a pass at me. I don't know what I would have done with that. I don't know what it would have been like if my youth group leader had called me inappropriately and asked me out on a date. I don't know what it would have been like to be leading on an executive team and feel like there was some odd dynamic going on between me and a fellow executive or me and my senior pastor. I think it would have undone me, to be really honest, and it undoes a lot of women. But the rules that we currently have from Billy Graham aren't helpful because what it intentionally does is protect us. What it unintentionally does is prevent women from being included in many leadership and development opportunities that they could really benefit from. Part of this is the culture we've developed around leadership development in church, which is very one-on-one mentorship style leadership development. One of the cases I make in the book is for integrating leadership and spiritual development into more connected, integrated ways. And part of that is because what I see happen with the guys that really propels them forward is that my leadership development and my spiritual mentorship integrate and become one. So the guy who's discipling me is also the guy who's speaking leadership development into me. And when I'm trying to discern my gifts, they're affirming my gifts and they're helping me see how I can use those gifts in ministry. When you're a woman growing up in a traditional church, those things are not connected. I go to discipleship and I learned about scripture and what it means to have a quiet and gentle spirit and how being a wife and mom is going to be awesome. And then I go to college or I go to my workplace or I go to something else and I'm talked about my leadership ability and how to hold a great meeting and what my potential for impact is. This is why so many women are really active in the church and doing direct sales of skincare and Mary Kay and every other thing because this is the place they're learning leadership. It's not happening over there. So we have to integrate those more, but we can't do it in a way that means the only way you get to grow as a leader is to spend time with one of your male pastors. And the only way you get leadership development is that if you can be one-on-one for lunch or drive in a car and go to a conference. And by the way, in our LGBTQ world, I don't think that men meeting only with men and women meeting only with women is no longer above reproach. I go to these conferences and I see senior pastors all the time traveling with some young seminary intern guy, and they're traveling together, they're saving money in a hotel room together, they're eating all their meals together, and I'm thinking that is not safety at all. We've been living in a very protected Christian bubble that doesn't allow for that anymore. The idea of leadership development, one of the key phrases that's been around for a while is this idea of always bringing someone with you. That if you're a leader and you have authority and practice of ministry in any way, you go to the hospital, you do a funeral, you go to a conference, you speak somewhere, you always take someone with you. Because in the process of doing your job, you're also developing someone. So you call whoever, someone on the team, some intern, a resident, you're like, hey, come to the hospital with me. On the way to the hospital, you talk, you chat, you ask them questions. They go in and watch you do ministry. On the way home, you debrief it, ask them questions, they ask you questions. It's a great leadership space, and it's very, very, very important. But my challenge is to switch our practice from taking one person to always taking two people. Now, you don't have to take girls if you don't want to, if you don't have girls on the team, but it gives women the opportunity to go along with you to the funeral, to go along with you to the conference, to see what it means to speak on stage, to understand what it's like to travel. All of those things happen. So always take two, a guy and a girl, two girls, two guys. It does a few things, by the way, from a leadership development strategy. First of all, it doubles your efforts. So now one funeral gives you two leadership development moments. You connect them to one another. One of the strongest challenges of leadership and ministry is isolation, especially as you grow. So when you pair people up to learn together, you're building a network of support that they'll take through their whole leadership. And you are creating a protected yet very open leadership space in your own leadership style. So always taking two with you, always making sure that we're practicing the right things. If you are a leader in your church, one of the most important things you can do is to talk about professional guidelines and professional behavior. Just saying the Billy Graham rule and simply making it about gender is not enough. So re-look at your policies, re-look at your practices. Talk regularly about what the real issue behind the rules is. The real issue is about purity of heart. The real issue is about integrity. The real issue is about who we are as believers more than who we are and what we can get away with and not get away with as leaders. I think one of the challenges with the Billy Graham rule being so prolific is that it's given men an ability to stay in leadership because they don't have any women around them as a way to deal with their actual sexual challenges that they're having, their lust issues, their objectification issues. I think if a pastor has those kind of issues, whether there are women around them or not, they have a lot of work to do before they should be leading in our churches. So I'm not saying get rid of it all, but I am saying let's rethink it. Let's challenge our practices. Let's make sure that when men and women are both invited to the leadership table, everybody gets time with you. Everybody gets to hear your heart as a leader. Everybody gets to have you ask them some questions, and everybody gets the chance to ask you questions. That's the way we build a really healthy and prolific leadership development culture. So those are the 3 keys to articulate your theology, to reach beyond the sticky floor, and to always take 2. I've got on my website, under the resources section, a few pieces. The book is there. It's on Amazon and Audible if you're at all interested in either of those formats. And we would really encourage you to read it, take a look at it. It's got a lot of great practical insights. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me on social media or through my website. Questions about your church or teams. But I also want to open it up for some questions here today. So anyone have or comments, suggestions, other things they'd like to share?
Hey, while people are thinking through that, question any hero stories that you have, like maybe of a female that you really look up to, but also a male who has advocated that you look up to greatly.
Oh, heroes for me?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the 2 kind of top male and female that I think of for my life, one is I had a mentor named Bob when I moved to Florida, and he was at that church with the drama. He actually ran the drama team and really mentored and stewarded my leadership gifts when it came to production arts and what it meant to do ministry in a current context. But more importantly, he gave me lots of opportunity. He gave me lots of great feedback. He gave me really great opportunities to fail, which I did a number of times, but then he helped me keep moving forward. Whenever you do something that's performance-oriented too, if any of you are in the performance side of ministry, it's like an extra double pressure, right? Because you're not just making a mistake, you're doing it like in front of everybody, and it's usually on film being broadcast somewhere. So it's just the ante goes up. But the other thing is that he was really great at stewarding my heart. He was one of the strongest voices about how our walk with the Lord is not about performance. He really counteracted some tendencies I have as a driven type A personality leader to be works-oriented instead of grace-oriented. And so I think what I appreciate most about him is he looked at me as a whole person, and he felt like he had responsibilities as a leader to leverage my gifts for the church. But he felt more passionate about his role as a spiritual leader to steward my soul for the kingdom. And so that balance was such great spiritual parenting. For women, my favorite, I call her my kick butt female leader, was my boss at the college, who was a very strong Christian and had been on local church staff a number of times before she took her vice presidency. And she was tough. She was so hard for me to work for and so challenging and held me to such a high standard. But the fact that it came packaged in a female Christian leader allowed me to really explore and maximize everything that I could. She wouldn't take any excuses from me. She didn't take any cop-outs because she could call my bluff on all of those things. And the other thing is she had the heart for local church ministry and the heart for developing and discipleship, but it was in a context not in local church. And I think for me, challenging me to leverage all my gifts in a space where I didn't question myself really prepared me to be able to bring all those gifts in a little bit more mature state into church ministry. Great question.
What else we got?
Safe place. Good questions. Or thoughts or comments or...
Hey, y'all. So a lot of that was about talking to leaders trying to develop younger people, but talk to the younger people about first steps to take as you are in this world that maybe they're not doing the things you just mentioned, right? So how do you engage and get traction in a context where they're maybe not thinking like about what you just talked about? Does that make sense?
So for young leader, male and female leaders, like how to do this differently?
Especially female leaders, how do you, young female leaders are trying to get traction in a church environment. Mm-hmm. How do you make your way into that environment and start to find, especially when they're not maybe thinking about the things you just said?
Yeah, that's a great question. So helping younger generation that maybe haven't had the same challenges, I'm thinking of what I was articulating. So I think for all young leaders, whether it's young in age or young in ability and experience, it's really important to steward well our journey into leadership. So one of the signs of youthfulness, and really it's immaturity because it's not about an age thing, is sort of this idea of being zealous for things, but not having the wisdom that goes with it. So one of the first attributes, I think, for any young leader is to make sure you're really working on the teachability aspect of what you're doing. And again, this isn't an age thing for me as much as it is a level of experience. And so all of us need to be teachable. All of us need to be coachable. But particularly when you're first starting out, is to ask lots of questions and ask good questions. Ask thoughtful questions. Observe, watch. Be responsible in how you're showing up so that you get the chance to ask great questions. So that would be the first thing. I think the second thing is to make sure that as you're journeying into established systems, particularly around this issue, to have grace for the people who have gone ahead of you. To have grace for your brothers who are leading churches and trying to navigate this hot topic. To have grace for the women who have gone before you and have had some hard hits along the way. One of the biggest challenges I've had in my leadership development, and it still surprises me, but the biggest resistance I've had to my leadership has always come from other women, particularly those who are further down the road than I am, older than me. And so knowing that you're walking into, most of the time you'll be walking into churches and organizations and systems that have been around for a long time and have certain ways of doing things. And most importantly, people have been taught to approach things in certain ways. But these things are shifting. And so giving grace for people to learn differently, giving grace and time for people to make changes, giving grace for each other along the way, that none of us are going to get this perfect. None of us really know how this is going to turn out for your local church at the time. And so how can you be an agent of change? Positive change? How can you be someone who helps move things forward? How can you be someone who builds trust? How can you be someone who brings great ideas in the context? How can you be aware enough about what's happening and yet know where you feel like it needs to go, that you can be a part of making things forward rather than criticizing it, rather than making negative comments, rather than questioning it, rather than ditching too early that you don't really fulfill the opportunity God has given you to bring change to somewhere. I think for young guys starting out in leadership, I think we have a whole generation of guys where they're kind of looking at some of these issues going like, this seems like a no-brainer. My 16-year-old is like, I can't believe people blah, 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 blah. But for them, realizing that everyone has a seat at the table, including you. One of the challenges that happens when women start rising up in leadership is that if we're not careful, we can champion women so much that we forget to develop the guys on our team. And so what we want is everyone to have a seat at the table. So guys need to lead strong and find your calling and make your way. And women need to do the same thing, but we need to do it together. One of the scriptures I've been spending a lot of time looking at lately is John 17, where Jesus is at the end of his life. He's saying his final prayer with the disciples, and then his very last prayer he says out loud, which is unlike him. It's not like him to pray in front of people or to pray out loud. So we know he wanted to tell us something with this prayer. And he prays for us. He prays for the disciples yet to come. And when I think of what was going to help the kingdom go forward as a church strategy person, I have a lot of ideas of what I think our churches should be doing. And he doesn't follow any of my ideas. He prays that we would have unity, that we would be together, that we would be one, just like he and the Father are one. Like, think of that closeness and unity they had. That's what he wants us to be like. When I go into Target or Home Goods or Super Walmart or wherever I'm online, my Facebook ads pop up. I can't get away from T-shirts and journals and mugs that tell me the future is female. But I'm a Christian. I've read John 17. I know Jesus' prayer, and I know what he's praying for us at the right hand of the Father right now. The future is not female. The future is not male. The future is together. And this generation, really our time, we are the first generation where I think we actually have the chance of leading the church together rather than apart. Patriarchy has been bad, but feminism is not helpful either. Like, togetherness is the future.
So if you're a 22-year-old female going into an interview, maybe a second-round interview where it's starting to get serious with a church, what questions would you ask directly to them about helping to understand what limitations they might have or where they're at on things in general?
Mm-hmm. So I think I would always ask, please tell me your theological stance on women in leadership. And just leave it very open, and just ask very plainly. If they can't answer you, that would probably be a red flag to me. So I would just ask it. I think the thing about the theological issue is that you can make a strong biblical case for any side of it. So that's why it's a hot topic. That's why it's debatable. That's why it's confusing, is because both sides see the biblical case for it. So just ask, what's your perspective? It's a secondary theological issue. It's not a primary one. People agree to disagree. You can still have fellowship with one another. You can still celebrate one another. You can still applaud what God is doing in different churches. And by the way, all the church growth, it doesn't matter. This has no indication to church growth or church success at all. So what's your theology about it? And just find out, and then ask yourself, is that something I can live with? Is that something I can lead in? Is that something I can support? Because coming into a church and not agreeing with key theological issues is the first way to kill your impact as a leader. So is this something that I can live with and that I want? And then secondly, what is it that you do to develop leaders? I would take the question, if it were me, I would take the question off of female and male at that point. I just want to know what you do for leaders. And if the answer is anything like, well, for guys we do this and girls we do this, that would be another red flag for me. Because leadership development is leadership development, and leadership is leadership. We don't actually learn leadership differently based on gender. We just see it played out differently based on calling. And so you're looking for a streamlined development process, even if it's like we take all our interns to these 2 conferences, fine. But it allows you to know that you're going to be in the circles where the leaders are being developed. One of the worst things you can do to develop women is to separate them and have a women's leadership training. Because women, when you lead in the church, in almost every ministry except one, has to deal with men. And even if you lead women's ministry, chances are the guy behind the sound booth is a guy. Chances are the person who set up your chairs is a guy. Chances are the person you report to is a guy. So helping women only know how to lead other women is a great disservice, tying one arm behind their back. It's like saying to all the guy pastors, we only will teach you about men. You only can communicate to men. You only know how to interact with men. We only give you money for men. Right? What senior pastor only wants to be able to talk to men? It's not who the church is. So looking for leadership pipelines, looking for theology, and then ask what kind of work are you going to be able to do. Many times women, oftentimes inadvertently, are given opportunities to lead by doing administrative clerical work. So I can't tell you the number of times I've talked with a senior executive pastor who's really excited about this female leader on their team, so they're going to promote her to his assistant so she can sit in on all the executive team meetings and take minutes. That is not a leadership role. That is someone who you want doing all your follow-up really well, and you trust her, which I appreciate that. But if you want to grow a leader, give her something to lead. Give her a team to lead. You don't lead anything as the administrative assistant. You book appointments. Put her in charge of a small group. Make her run student ministries. Give her all of the greeters. Have her run the parking lot. Make her in charge of communications. Give her a job that has to deliver, and give her a team or the opportunity to recruit a team that she actually gets to grow in leadership.
Anybody else?
Sweet. Okay, so I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the third point, the take two, because I know that, like you were saying, it can be dangerous for assumptions and as long as that, but I also know that it can kind of seem influential a lot to have that like parental role of the one-on-one. So would you say when you mentor people, you always go one-on-two, or just when you take them to things in like real life application of it?
Yeah, I think there's probably about 10 to 15% of a leader's life that is best dealt with gender-only support. In the book, I kind of talk about it as coaching, where women really need women coaches and men really need guy coaches, because we are men and women, and we are different. And so there are elements of my life that I need a female role model, but most of it has to do with how I'm personally navigating the other aspects of my life and how that intersects with my leadership. It doesn't really have to do with how I balance my budget, how I get up on stage and communicate, although they tell me things like don't wear dangly earrings because it interrupts with the microphone. Guys, don't worry about that. Well, I shouldn't say that. I see lots of guys with earrings, but you know what I'm saying. So there is a piece of that is really important, but the majority of it is basic leadership that is the same for everyone. Leadership skills, leadership training, how you build trust, how you communicate vision, those are just non-gender-based skill sets. But there is a piece of it that goes together. I think also one thing that happens to guys that isn't as big of a trap for women is they tend to feel like the leaders who are their bosses are also their best spiritual mentors. And I think that's actually really dangerous in leadership circles. Now, I think you get mentoring from that, but that would be kind of like saying, for me, I worked as a nurse in a hospital, and my manager was a Christian. So not only was she my manager, but she's now responsible for all my spiritual growth. It's a heavy load to put on your boss, and it makes it very difficult to boss that way when you're also trying to develop someone. So all of us need a lot of mentors. All of us need a lot of spiritual voices. All of us need a lot of role models. And so diversifying ourselves and not looking up to one leader to be everything is a piece of maturity. And so making sure you've got lots of voices and lots of people. When it comes to the gender thing, I think you have to learn from both men and women. And partly because there are women who have really strong, loud, powerful leadership gifts, and there are men who are more pastoral, more mercy gifts, more relational. I learn from both of them. And so all of us need to learn from both of them, regardless of gender.
All right, last question here.
And so as I listen to this, I have that I think it's a fear-driven question that pops into my mind of like, ooh, how are we doing with this? And the question is how to shift it from how are we doing? Are we checking the boxes to something that's actually moving towards making a difference and doing what you're doing, what your book is, developing female leaders. So and maybe it's just read my book and we'll be good to go, right? But would there be some quick things to get us moving in the right direction to not lead from fear-based, but into something that matters?
Yeah. I do think this is a very fear-charged, emotional subject for everybody. I would say the most important and first step, regardless of what you do, is just to begin talking about it. To be able to say and even acknowledge, so I have a really weird idea, or I have a topic that I want to begin talking about that's probably going to elicit a lot of emotion. It's just acknowledge the elephant in the room. But then as the leader, to also be able to say, but I don't want to be someone who avoids hard topics. We're not called to shy away from the things that could actually be a breakthrough moment for us. And so I want to begin exploring what this looks like. So you can even tell from my language, there's no decision made. It's very investigative. It's very collaborative. It's very slow-paced. It's trying to acknowledge and disarm. Part of the challenge with this topic is that this is a theological belief, which means it's how we view God. And when we begin to question our view of God and how that plays out in each of our lives, then it is unnerving. And it feels like it could be a slippery slope. And it does make us all kind of stand up a little bit, as it should. Now, the thing that's encouraging is that if you have a lot of people who engage this and are very passionate about it, it's actually a great sign that you have really biblically literate leaders on your hands. I always worry about the church who comes and flips on their theology on this topic. Either way, by the way, we see churches going both directions, and the church doesn't care. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm not sure that's a good sign. So when people are animated about this, when they bring a lot of energy to it, when there is a fear that we might be going down a road that's unbiblical, that is a sign that you've got really godly, caring, passionate people who care about the truth. The second thing is to begin exploring with the right people, what does God's word actually say? How did we arrive at the conclusion we're at? What have we inherited? What pieces are accurate? If it was created in the 1930s, it may have different application than it does today and still be the same theology. That has to be part of the discussion. If we're actually looking at a theological change, let's talk about that. Who would we trust to guide us on that? There's so many questions to ask. The biggest mistake I see people making on this subject is that they rush it. The leader gets it in his mind, does his own personal research, feels satisfied, and then unleashes it to the congregation as if it's like a new capital campaign. This is different. This is coming down to the foundations of our identity and our roles and how the church functions. And especially for women, it intersects every part of our life. Because your theology about me as a leader changes how my family operates, changes the kind of career confidence I have, changes how I parent, changes how I raise my children, changes what I do with my volunteer hours. Like, it has great impacts on all parts about me. And I want to live according to what God says about me, and I need you as my spiritual leader to guide me into what that is. And I want to be able to ask questions, and I want to be able to challenge, and I want to be able to be challenged. So it's a long process. I'm not saying it takes 7 years. I'm just saying don't do it in a month. Take the time, bring people with you. Make sure everyone's got a chance to ask and to be a part of it. It's collaboration is not consensus. So you're not asking everyone's opinion, but you can collaborate in the process and get everybody's voice at least heard and acknowledged. And there is quite a few things in the book.
All right. Let's thank Katie for coming and
Thank
joining
you
with us
so
today.
much.
Just a reminder that Daniel Eam will be here on March 9th. We want to welcome you here for that. Other than that, let me just pray for you real quick, and then we'll go. Father, we are just grateful for the wisdom we've heard today. We are thankful for those people who have gone before us, who have helped set the way and helped to be examples for us. And we pray, Lord, that you would bless us as we wrestle with how exactly we can help to develop every leader, especially today, female leaders, Lord, into their roles in the church. Bless us through your Spirit, and we're just grateful for the wisdom we've heard today. In Christ's name, amen.